Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today, we're returning to Edgar Cayce and covering a topic we haven't covered with Edgar Cayce, and in particular, it's Atlantis. Edgar Cayce has been called the sleeping prophet, the father of holistic medicine, the miracle man of Virginia Beach, and the most documented psychic of all time. For 43 years of his adult life, he had the ability to put himself into some kind of self-induced sleep state by lying down on a couch, closing his eyes, and folding his hands over his stomach. This state of relaxation and meditation enabled him to place his mind in contact with all time and space and to respond to any questions that he was asked. Edgar Cayce dictated all of his discourses from a self-induced trance. A stenographer took his discourses down in shorthand and later typed them. In his normal consciousness, Edgar Cayce spoke with a southern accent, but in the same manner as any other American. However, from the trance state, he spoke in the manner of the King James Bible, using these and thous, which has made it hard in some cases for me to read these essentially channelings. They're kind of more than channelings, because in some cases, people find it a little hard to understand. In trance, his syntax was unusual. He put phrases, clauses, and sentences together in a manner that slows down any reader and requires careful attention in order to be sure of his meaning. This caused his stenographer to adopt some unusual punctuation in order to put into sentence form some of the long, complex thoughts conveyed by Cayce while in trance. From his trance state, Cayce explained that he got his information from two sources. First of all, the inquiring individual's mind, mostly from his or her deeper subconscious mind. And secondly, from the universal consciousness, the infinite mind within which the entire universe is conscious. He explained that every action and thought of every individual makes an impression upon the universal consciousness, an impression that can be physically read. He correlated this with the Hindu concept of an Akashic record, which is an ethereal fourth-dimensional film upon which actions and thoughts are recorded and can be read at any time. I find it interesting that occasionally he would not have the material being requested. He would say, "We do not have that here," which implied that his mind was more directed than one might think. He was not open to everything. From trance, he explained that the suggestion given at the beginning of one of his psychic readings so directed his deeper mind and focused it on the task or subject requested that he truly did not have other topics available. What is particularly fascinating is that after a few life readings for reincarnated Atlanteans, the staff working with Edgar Cayce decided to get a series of readings devoted solely to understanding Atlantis. And through his readings, there were many revelations about Atlantis. I discussed some of this in my episode on Edgar Cayce and the children of the Law of One. In particular, Cayce placed Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean and suggested it existed from about 50,000 to 10,000 BC, with its destruction occurring in several stages. He described Atlantis as technologically advanced, far surpassing the capabilities of his time. This included the use of crystals for energy, flying crafts called airships, and sophisticated medical technology. Cayce described Atlantis as being a highly spiritual and advanced civilization. Atlanteans were portrayed as deeply attuned to spiritual laws and cosmic truths. They possessed a profound understanding of life and the universe, which was reflected in their society and technologies. This period was marked by harmony, enlightenment, and a connection to higher spiritual dimensions. One of the unique aspects of the Atlantean spirituality, as I mentioned earlier, was their use of crystals. These crystals were not only used for technological purposes, but also integral to spiritual practice. Cayce's readings often referenced the Law of One, a concept indicating a period when Atlanteans were united in their belief in a single spiritual divine source. Now, while some people claim this is different than the Law of One mentioned by Ra, it's all one. And I think it's definitely the same thing, and they had access to the Law of One information. This belief system fostered unity and peace and an understanding of the interconnectedness of all life. And over time, Cayce indicated that Atlanteans began to drift away from their spiritual principles. This decline was characterized by materialism, egoism, and a disconnect from their earlier spiritual practices and beliefs. The misuse of their advanced technologies for selfish purposes symbolized this moral decay. And as Atlanteans became more technologically advanced, they started using their technologies for power, control, and serving the self, rather than for the common good. Cayce specifically mentioned the misuse of the crystal technology, which had severe consequences. This misuse led to social divisions and conflicts within Atlantis. The spiritual decline was seen as having karmic implications. Cayce suggested that the moral and spiritual failings of the Atlanteans set into motion a series of events that ultimately led to the downfall of their civilization. In Cayce's view, many souls who had incarnated during the time of Atlantis were reincarnating in his era, and we can see it now. He believed these souls carried with them lessons from the rise and fall of Atlantis, influencing the spiritual evolution of the current age. Cayce's accounts of Atlantis serve as a cautionary tale for modern civilizations. He emphasized the importance of balancing spiritual development with technological advancement. Now, while I've already talked about it in another episode that was dedicated to the children of the Law of One, it's very interesting to return to this in reference to Atlantis. The Atlanteans who adhered to the Law of One reportedly lived in harmony and unity, but the decline of Atlantis began when segments of the population moved away from the Law of One. The shift led to a development of opposing groups within Atlantean society, often referred to as the Sons of Belial in his readings, and these groups prioritized material gain and power over spiritual values. According to Cayce, the destruction of Atlantis happened in several major cataclysms due to natural disasters and the misuse of technology. He mentioned that survivors migrated to other parts of the world, influencing the development of future civilizations in Egypt, the Americas, and Europe. One of the most intriguing aspects of Cayce's readings is the mention of the Hall of Records. He claimed that the Atlanteans stored their knowledge in 3 repositories located in Egypt near the Sphinx, the Bahamas, and the Yucatan, and these records supposedly contain the history of Atlantis and human civilization. And while some people have claimed to have accessed this Hall of Records, it's just simply not believable, at least to the sources that are available now. I'm aware of the Emerald Tablets, and there's definitely questions about the validity of that material, at least the later material that was produced. Cayce stated that the Atlanteans created 3 Hall of Records, the primary one located near the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt, another located in the Yucatan Peninsula, and the third was believed to be in the Bahamas near the Bimini Islands. The Hall of Records was said to house the collective wisdom and history and technology of the Atlantean civilization. This includes records of the spiritual and technological advancements of Atlantis, as well as information about the origins and history of human civilization. The Hall of Records in Egypt was particularly significant in Cayce's readings. He claimed that it was situated under or near the Sphinx, and that it contained not only records of Atlantis, but also prehistoric information about the history of the Earth and the human race. And I believe it's possible that those records have been accessed by some secret societies, and we just simply have not been given the information that was given it, or they couldn't access the technologies that were used to store that information. Cayce prophesied that the Hall of Records would be rediscovered and opened between the 20th century and the early 21st century. He believed that this event would lead to a period of significant spiritual and technological advancement for humanity. And while that may have happened, there has not been a public disclosure of anything like that happening as of yet, at least that is credible. The teachings suggested that the knowledge contained in the Hall of Records influenced the development of ancient Egyptians and Mesoamerican civilizations, and this knowledge transfer was believed to have occurred through Atlantean survivors who migrated to these regions after the destruction of their homeland. Cayce's view was that the rediscovery of the Hall of Records was not just a matter of historical or archaeological interest. He linked it to the spiritual evolution of humanity, suggesting that individuals reincarnated from Atlantis would play a role in uncovering these records, fulfilling a karmic cycle. Mainstream archaeology and Egyptology have not found evidence to support Cayce's claims. His readings on this topic, like much of his work, are often viewed with skepticism by the scientific community, of course. However, they continue to fascinate and inspire those interested in alternative histories and metaphysical subjects. And what I'm most interested in is his references to the psychic Atlanteans, and I'm going to read a portion of that. But I wanted to read some of what he said initially about Atlantis, describing it, and then read a little bit more about the psychic Atlanteans. We begin with a reading number 364-1. This one was given on February 3rd, 1932. You will have before you the subject for address to be given on Atlantis. You will give in lecture form the material which should be present at that time. Cayce says, yes, we have the body, the inquiring mind, and that as may be given on such a subject. In many ways, this would be better were it divided into 2 lectures. This, however, as we find, may be presented somewhat in this manner. Atlantis as a continent is a legendary tale. Whether or not that which has been received through psychic sources has for its basis those few lines given by Plato, or the references made in Holy Writ that the earth was divided, depends upon the trend of individual minds. Recently, however, the subject has taken on greater import, since some scientists have declared that such a continent was not only a reasonable and plausible matter, but from evidence being gradually gathered, was a very probable condition. As we recognize, there has been considerable given respecting such a lost continent by those channels such as the Writer of 2 Planets, or Atlantis, or Poseida and Lemuria, that has been published through some of the theosophical literature. As to whether this information is true or not depends upon the credence individuals give to this class of information. Then, it has seemed well to many of this group that those channels through which information may be obtained interest themselves in such an undertaking, as to gain through those channels such information that might be applicable in the lives or experiences of individuals interested in such. From time to time, in and through the information obtained for some individuals in their life readings, has come that they, as an entity or individual, occupied some particular place or performed some activity in some portion of that continent, or emigrated from that continent to some other portion of the Earth's surface at the time, and began some particular development. These must have been a busy folk, for with their advent into other climes, as the information runs, they began to make many changes from the activities in that particular sphere in which they entered. Then, if we are to accept such a being of fact or fiction, may truly depend upon what value to the human family knowledge concerning such a peoples would be in the affairs of individuals today. What contribution would information be to the minds of individuals as to knowing or understanding the better or closer relations to the creative forces? Or, to put it another manner, what would information of that nature mean to my soul today? Be it true that there is the fact of reincarnation, and that souls that once occupied such an environment are entering the Earth's sphere and inhabiting individuals in the present. Is it any wonder that, if they made such alterations in the affairs of the earth in their day as to bring destruction upon themselves, if they are entering now, they might make many changes in the affairs of peoples and individuals in the present? Are they then being born into the world? If so, what were their environs? And will those environs mean in a material world today? To be continued, we are through for the present. Then on the 16th of February 1932, he talked about Atlantis some more, stating, yes, we have the subject in those conditions, As has been said, much data has been received from time to time through psychic forces as respecting conditions in or through the period or ages of this continent's existence. That the continent existed is being proven as a fact. Then what took place during the period or periods when it was being broken up? What became of the inhabitants? What was the character of their civilization? Are there any evidences of those or any portion of the inhabitants' escape? The position of the continent and the like must be of interest to peoples in the present day, if either by inference that individuals are being born into the earth plane to develop in the present, or are being guided in their spiritual interpretation of individuals' lives or developments by the spirits of those who inhabited such a continent. In either case, if these be true, they are wielding and are to wield an influence upon the happenings of the present-day world. The position as the continent Atlantis occupied is that as between the Gulf of Mexico on the one hand and the Mediterranean upon the other. Evidences of their lost civilization are to be found in the Pyrenees and Morocco on the one hand, British Honduras, Yucatan, and America upon the other. There are some protruding portions within this that must have at one time or another been a portion of this great continent, the British West Indies or the Bahamas, and a portion of the same that may be seen in the present, if the geological survey would be made in some of these, especially or notably in Bimini, and in the Gulf Stream through this vicinity. This may be even yet determined. Side note, the Bimini Road was later discovered after this reading. He goes on to say that, what then are the character of the peoples? To give any proper conception, may we follow the line of a group or an individual line through this continent's existence and gain from same something of their character, their physiognomy, and their spiritual and physical development. In the period then, some 98,000 years before the entry of Ram into India, there lived in this land of Atlantis one Amelius, who had first noted that of the separations of the beings as inhabited that portion of the earth's sphere or plane of those peoples into male and female as separate entities or individuals. As to their forms in the physical sense, these were much rather of the nature of thought forms, or able to push out of themselves in that direction in which its development took shape in thought, much in the way and manner as the amoeba would in the waters of a stagnant bay or lake in the present. As they took form by the gratifying of their own desire for that as built or added to the material conditions, they became hardened or set much in the form of the existent human body of the day, with that of color as partook of its surroundings, much in the manner of the chameleon in the present, hence coming into that form as the red or the mixture peoples or colors, known then later by the association as the red race. These then able to use in their gradual development all the forces as were manifest in their individual surroundings, passing through those periods of developments as has been followed more closely in that of the yellow, the black, or the white races in other portions of the world, yet with their immediate surroundings, with the facilities for the developments, these became much speedier in this particular portion of the globe than in others. And while the destruction of this continent and the peoples are far beyond any of that as has been kept as an absolute record, that record in the rock still remains, as has that influence of those peoples in that life of those peoples to whom those that did escape during the periods of destruction make or influence the lives of those peoples to whom they came, as they may in the present, either through the direct influence of being regenerated or reincarnated into the earth, or through that of the mental application on through the influences as may be had upon thought of individuals or groups by speaking from that environment. In that manner of living, in the manner of the moral, of the social, of the religious life of these peoples, their classes existed much in the same order as existed among others, yet like of the warlike influence did not exist in the peoples as a people as it did in other portions of the universe. There are so many details about what sort of cities they built and how they built their cities and what they were like that you can find in the book called Atlantis by Edgar Cayce. What I wanted to focus on, at least for this episode in particular, was the psychic Atlanteans. Edgar Cayce gave a series of readings which he described how the Atlanteans were initially quite psychic, to the point that we could not understand them and their lives if we did not grasp just how psychic they were. Here is that reading. I believe it adds to our study of the psychic sense, especially since Cayce predicted that humanity would regain these powerful abilities in the near future. This particular channeling or reading came on April 28th, 1932. You will have before you the information given through this channel on the lost continent of Atlantis. You will please continue with this information and answer the questions which I will ask regarding the same. Cayce says, yes, in understanding then, in the present terminology, occult science or psychic science, as seen, this was the natural or nature's activity in that experience and not termed as science, any more than would be the desire for food be a newborn babe. Rather, the natural consequence, this explanation may of necessity take on some forms that may possibly be confusing at times, but illustrations may be made through the various types of occult science or psychic manifestations that may clarify for the student something of the various types of psychic manifestations in the present, as well as that was natural in this period. There is, as has been oft given, quite a difference, and much differentiation should be made in mysticism and psychic or occult science as termed today. From that which has been given, it is seen that individuals in the beginning were more of thought forms than individual entities with personalities as seen in the present, and their projections into the realms of fields of thought that pertain to a developing or evolving world of matter, with the varied presentations about same of the expressions or attributes in the various things about the entity or individual or body through which such science as termed now, or such phenomena as would be termed, became manifest. Hence we find occult or psychic science, as would be called at the present, was rather the natural state of man in the beginning, very much as in illustration when a baby or babe is born into the world and its appetite is first satisfied and it lies sleeping. Of what is its dreams? That it expects to be or that it has been? Of what are thoughts? That which is to be or that which has been or that which is? Now remember, we are speaking. These were thought forms, and we are finding again the illustrations of same. When the mental body, now revert back to what you are calling science, when the mental body or mind has had training or has gone through a course of operations in certain directions, such individuals are called so and so minded, as one of an inventive turn, and trained one of a statistician turn, and trained one of the theologian turn, and trained one of the philosophical turn, and trained. Of what does the mind build? We have turned then to that has become very material, for the mind constantly trained makes for itself mental pictures, or makes that as is reasoned with from its own present dimensional viewpoints. But the babe, from whence its reasoning, from whence its dream, from that has been taken in, or that has been in its experience from whence it came. Oft has it been said, and rightly, with a babe's smile, dreaming of angels, and close in touch with them. But what has produced that dream? The contact with that upon which it has fed. Don't forget our premise now, from which we are reasoning, and we will find that we will have the premise from which those individuals or the entities reasoned within the beginning in this land. We are speaking of Atlanteans when they became as thought forces. From whence did they reason? From the creative forces from which they had received their impetus, but acted upon by the thought forms as were in material forms about them, and given that power, to be one with that form, what it sprang or was given its impetus or force, yet with the ability to use that in the way that seemed or seemeth good or well or pleasing unto itself. Hence we find in this particular molding or moldive stage that in which there was the greater development of and use of that as is termed or called psychic or occult forces or science in the present terminology or age, illustrating then that as to how this was used by those entities, those beings in the formative stage of their experience or sojourn among that as had been created in all of its splendor to supply every want or desire that might be called forth by that being, with all of its attributes, physical, mental, and spiritual at hand. For as has been given even unto the 400,000th generation from the first creation was it prepared for man's indwelling. As we today turn to today, we find there the developments of those resources. How long have they remained? Since the beginning. How long has man been able to use them for his undoing, or his pleasure, or for his regeneration? Since this knowledge of some source has awakened within its psychic force or source of the apparatus, or the form that it takes, either in a physical or mental, for remember, mind is the builder, and it moves along those channels through which and by which it may bring into existence in whatever dimension or sphere from which it is reasoning or reasoning toward, and as they may be illustrated in the present. When there is a manifestation of a psychic force, or an occult action, or phenomenon, or activity in, upon, of, or for an individual, there is then the rolling back, as it were, or a portion of the physical consciousness, or that mental trained individual consciousness has been rolled aside or rolled back, and there is then a visioning. To what? That as from the beginning a projection of that form that assumed its position or condition in the earth as from the beginning, and with those so endowed with that as may be called in insight into psychic sources, there may be visioned about a body its astral, if chosen to be termed, rather than its thought body as is projected from same in such a state. Especially so when there is the induction or the inducing of an unconsciousness of the normal brain or normal mental body, submerged into what? Into the unconscious or subconscious. Sub in this instance meaning below, not above normal, below, subject to the higher consciousness or to the higher thought that has been built, just as sure as has a physical body been built from what? That as has been given from its first nucleus as passing through in its experience. Then there may be vision by such a body as may be called with the second sight, or with a vision that accompanying thought body of such a one, manifesting in much the way and manner as individuals in the Atlantean period of psychic and occult development brought about in their experience. Through such projections there came about the first necessity of the division of the body to conform to those necessities of that as seen in its own mental vision as built mental now. Don't confuse these terms or else you'll become very confused in what is being given. The mental vision, by its action upon what body is being built, on the mental body of the individual in a material world, out of spirit, out of the ability to have all the attributes of the spiritual or unseen forces, but materialized forces as is necessary from the mental body in a material world mentally trained to, or in certain directions or given directions, or following the natural bent of its threefold or three-ply body as is seen in every individual or every entity. As these projected themselves, then we find these developments were in this portion of the development in the Atlantean period. How were these used? In much as were from the beginning. Remember, there was ever the instruction to those peoples that they were to hold to that would bring for the spiritual forces, rather than the abuses of the abilities, as those with familiar spirits, as those that spoke to or partook of the divinations of those that had passed from the earth's plane, or those that partook of the animal magnetism that came from the universal consciousness of animal matter as passed into its experience in its interchange through those periods of integration and disintegration, and the spirit forces possessing those that would lay themselves open to such conditions. For these are as real as physical bodies, if the attunements of the entity are such that it may vision them. And they are about you always, sure. These then are entities, sure, whether animal or those endowed with the soul, until they pass through those changes, as there ever has been. See, also there are those that ever make for those channels in the psychic and occult we are speaking of, through which man, as it reached that stage or that position, that it became farther and farther from its natural sources, through the same character of channel may it communicate with that form which it is a portion or of the creative forces. And hence, the terminology arose as good spirits and bad spirits, for there are those that partake of the earth or of the carnal forces, rather than of those forces that are of the spiritual or creative. Those that are destruction are of the earth. Those that are constructive then are the good, or the divine and the devilish, bringing for those developments in their various phases. Hence, the greater development of that called occult or psychic forces during the Atlantean period, and the use of same, and the abuse of same was during its first 1,000 years, as we would call light years, not the light of the star, but the sun goes down and then the sun goes down years, that brought about those cycles or those changes. Hence, we have that which has been given through many of the sources of information or the channels for the individuals, and in those, these the entity as a voice upon waters, or as the wind that moved among the reeds and hearkened, or again, as when the morning stars sang together, and the sons of God beheld the coming of man into his own, through the various realms, as were brought by the magnifying of, or the deteriorating of, the use of those forces and powers, as manifested themselves in a material area, or those that partook of carnal to the gratification of that brought about its continual hardening and less ability to hearken back through that from which it came, and partaking more and more of that upon which it became an eater of, or as is seen even in the material forces in the present. We find those that partake of certain elements, unless these become very well balanced with all sources of what? That of which there were the first causes or nature or natural or God sources or forces are. Hence, elements, not rudiments, elements, as are termed in the terminology of the student of the anatomical, physiological, psychological forces within a body, germs. Sure, they are germs, for each are as atoms of power. From what? That source from which it has drawn its essence upon what it feeds. Is one feeding then its soul, or is one feeding its body? Or is one feeding that in between, its mental body, to its own undoing, or to those foolishness of the simple things of life? Being able then to partake of the physical, but not a part of the same, but more and more feeding upon the sources from which it emanates, or the spiritual life, so that the physical body, the mental body, are attuned to its soul forces, or its soul source, its creator, its maker, in such a way and manner as it develops. What then is psychic force? What is occult science? A developing of the abilities within each individual that has not lost its sonship or its relation to the creator, to live upon or demonstrate more and more through phenomena of whatever nature from which it takes the source for that individual activity of that entity itself, through the stages of development through which it has passed, and giving of its life source, that there may be brought into being that which gives more knowledge of the source from which the entity essence emanates. And the more this may be manifest, the greater becomes the occult force. To what uses then did these people in this particular period give their efforts, and in what directions were they active? As many almost as there were individuals, for as we find from the records as are made, to some there was given the power to become the sons of God. Others were workers in brass, in iron, in silver, in gold. Others were made in music and the instruments of music. These then we find in the world today. Those that are especially gifted in art, in its various forms, and a real artist, as the world looks at it, isn't very much fit for anything else, yet it is what? An expression of its concept of that from which that entity sprang through the various stages of its evolution in a material world, or that which it fed its soul or its mental being for its development through its varied experiences in a material world. These then are but manifestations in individuals who are called geniuses or gifted in certain directions. These then are the manners in which entities, those beings, those souls in the beginning partook of or developed. Some brought about monstrosities, as those of its association by its projection with its association with beasts of various characters, hence those of the Styx, satyr, and the like, those of the sea or mermaid, those of the unicorn, and those of the various forms. These projections of what? The abilities in the psychic forces. There is so much more that I could talk about, but as you can tell from this little bit that I read, it's complicated. It's hard to understand. And you may not enjoy an entire reading of a book of just readings on Atlantis. In many cases, these particular readings were addressed to individuals. And so it doesn't come through like a normal channeling like we do with Quo. But what we get from this is that during the time of Atlantis, particularly in the beginning, when Atlanteans were at their highest psychic progression, they were thought forms. And that they developed as thought forms in the beginning. And a word that's used here, if you go back and listen, is regeneration. In addition to reincarnation, meaning that individuals could regenerate, come back alive without actually reincarnating. And that there was some sort of evolution that occurred from the thought form into the physical manifestation of a body. So what we're getting is a very occult and different sort of impression of how Atlanteans developed, not from just natural evolution, but through thought forms, and we would never truly understand. And maybe that changes our perspective of this, of what was happening in Atlantis. Perhaps our understandings of Atlantis was a more spiritual dimension that occurred that eventually grafted itself onto the earth. I have no idea. I would love to know. Obviously, this is a very popular topic, and I've met many people that have memories from a time of Atlantis in their own reincarnations. And there are some really, really profoundly interesting books that have been written on Atlantis. All of this goes along with what was talked about in the raw material about Atlantis. We will truly never know unless we can go deep in the ocean and uncover some of the history that is buried deep there. And I would like for that to happen. There is this other argument that has come through the media that may be true, that we can see Atlantis in the Sahara Desert, and that rings true to me as well. And so maybe a lot of what he's talking about isn't true. I just wanted to share it with you because we're all students of this material, and it's a little dense and hard to understand. And this is sort of an introduction as to what Edgar Cayce was talking about in regards to Atlantis and how they lived, and in particular, the psychic Atlanteans. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and welcome to The Reality Revolution.